Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Will he not first sit down and estimate the cost to see if he has enough money to complete it? But if he lays a foundation and is not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule him, saying, "This fellow began to build but was not able to finish." Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Will he not first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he's not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off, and will ask for terms of peace. In the same way, any one of you who does not give up everything he has cannot be my disciple. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear. Amen.
Amen.
It's a privilege and a joy to be able to share in this very special occasion. And I think some of the family will probably find this moderately amusing that there were one or two occasions where, when I was based some years ago in my ministry at Wilsden and with the satellite churches at Wellspring, West Hendon and Camrose, there were one or two times when I'd asked different members of the Tyne family to read the scripture, and they would kind of appear just in time to walk in from the back, all the way down to the front, and then open the Bible and immediately read. And I suppose now they can take great pleasure in knowing that now the same has happened to me. And I walked in the back and they came straight up in the front and was able to read. So it's singularly appropriate on an occasion like this. We say something in English, what goes around comes around. So we're here, and we're here reflecting on discipleship. And it's very important that we relate the act of baptism with discipleship. This is not representing a decision. It's representing a life change. The danger is many people can choose to become Christians, but actually it doesn't lead to a substantive change in the way that they operate as people. It's very easy to turn over a new leaf, to make some sort of initial response, rather than actually buying into being a different person. Being a different person is much more fundamental. It's hugely costly. But in terms of faith, when you invest something fully of yourself, then obviously there is a very deep return. So this is a picture of not a decision, but of discipleship. And throughout the Gospels, and we're just for a few moments going to reflect on this passage, I felt drawn to this passage as I was thinking and praying about today. This passage gives just a few very simple guidelines about what baptism represents in terms of discipleship. It's set in the context where Jesus is telling parables. And in the previous parable, the parable of the great banquet, he talks about how God throws a great feast. I mean, again, sometimes we can misunderstand the nature of the Christian faith. Some people see Christianity as being something very dour and very serious. Now, it has serious consequences, both in terms of our commitment to God and not committing ourselves to God. But the lovely thing is that Jesus, in his ministry, often compares our experience of faith as being a very attractive thing. I can say again, I think respectfully, that Sri Lankans like throwing a big meal. I'm not even sure, but I would be amazed if there isn't food at some point today. Because food is so much part of Sri Lankan culture, and the throwing of the big feast, and it's always a big feast. You know, English people, we do sandwiches. And Sri Lankans, just kind of don't get sandwiches. So it's always much more. It's the big banquet. And a banquet is a celebration. And so Jesus says becoming a Christian, becoming a disciple is like being invited not to a small buffet, but a great big banquet. But sometimes people, they don't want to make the cost of actually turning up to the banquet, even though it's something which is actually going to be a benefit to them. And so they give lame excuses. And in this previous parable, they give excuses which become progressively more and more stupid. First person says, in verse 18, I've just bought a field, and I must go and see it. That's daft. If you bought a field, why would you then need to go and see it? It's like saying, I've bought a house, and I'll just go and check it's still there. What chances are it is going to still be there? So why would you think that you bought something which you clearly have investigated, and then think you've got to go back to look at it a second time. It's just an excuse, and a very poor one at that. But the excuses get worse. And then the next person who says, I don't want to be a disciple, said, I've just bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I'm on my way to try them out. That is about as ridiculous as saying, I bought a VW Polo, I've sorted out the finance, and now I'm going to test drive it. I mean, people don't do that sort of thing. If it's a second-hand vehicle, you would test drive it first, and then you would say, this is now my vehicle. You wouldn't need to drive it again. So in the same way, you don't need to find out if the oxen are capable of the job. You would have done that. Worse still, then he says, I've just got married, so I can't come. Now, there are children in the house, but you can understand that's not an acceptable excuse either. It's flippant and it's disrespectful. It's saying, I've got far better pleasure that I want to engage with rather than being a disciple. So they're bad excuses. But he's saying that there are reasons that people will parade to not become disciples. So we read in verse 25. Then he says, large crowds came to him. He was probably travelling in the area of Perea, which is on the eastern side of the river of the Sea of Galilee. And they were following him, and they were trying to find out from him how to become disciples. But again, as in the previous parable, he's saying, do you really know what you're buying into? Are you really up for this? And so he turns to them and seeks to address some of their concerns. And he says, first of all, there is a priority in discipleship. He says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and his mother, his wife and his children, his brothers and his sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Now, I've been a pastor for some 25, 26 years, and without being, again, facetious, actually, some of my time is taken up with people who can't stand their families, and they can't stand their parents, and they can't stand their brothers and sisters. And in fact, actually, they're looking at this and saying, if the qualification for me to be a true disciple is actually not liking my father and mother, not liking my wife, not liking my children, not liking my brothers and sisters, I'm up for this. I'm already there. I don't need to buy into this because I can't stand my family anyway. And they can misunderstand what's being said. What is being said here, the Greek word for hate, is miseo, which doesn't mean despise. It doesn't mean disdain. It means value less. The simple but important point that Jesus is making about discipleship, first of all, is that the priority of discipleship is that you should be more committed to the Lord than your family. Now that is a strong statement. It's a strong statement even in a community such as our own in Britain, where there is a lot of dysfunction in family life and people feel less connected to families. Within Sri Lankan culture, it seems to me there probably is a stronger sense of family cohesion than there would be, say, in the Western world. And so these words resonate with even a greater strength in your culture. They're strong words. They're not saying that I should disdain my family, but they are saying I should contextualize my family, putting the Lord first. Some of you will know my journey, but when I began to enter into faith, I was 16 years of age. My dad was an atheist. My mum was agnostic, which really meant that she went to church at Christmas and Easter and didn't believe the rest of the year. So she was a kind of a casual non-believer, and my dad was a committed non-believer. And for me then to suddenly start going to church and become a committed evangelical Christian, which was as a result of the witness of a school friend, was a massive change for me, but it had great implications for my family. And initially, I knew that in becoming a committed Christian, it would put a strain on my relationship with my entire family. I knew of no one in my immediate family who was a committed Christian. And so in making the choice to become a Christian, and then telling my parents I was going to be baptized, I can remember them feeling very anxious and sometimes very negative about the experience. I remember the debate that went on about whether my parents would deign even to come to my baptism, and about the fact that my parents felt embarrassed about the level of my commitment of faith. And I knew that for a season, and I had no idea how long, my commitment to Jesus was going to stand in juxtaposition to my commitment to my family. And so it was hard for a while. But gradually they began to mellow, and in answer to prayer, 9 years later, I had the privilege of leading my parents of faith, and then about another 3 or 4 years later, baptizing both of them in my first church at Wilston. But it was difficult at the beginning. Jesus is saying, at the beginning, you have to decide who is first. Is it Jesus, or is it your family? Is it your wife, or is it your family? Is it your commitment to your husband, or Jesus? Is it your commitment to your family, or children, or Jesus? Is Jesus really going to take the first place? I remember another lady called Rose, who one or two of us remember from the days in Wilston, and she first came to a morning service, and she was wearing a Muslim head covering, which was against unusual in a Baptist church. And I said, have you worshipped regularly somewhere else? And she said, yes, Regent's Park Mosque. Now, normally when somebody comes into a Baptist church, they almost say, I used to go to Rainers Lane Baptist Church, not Regent's Park Mosque. And I thought, I don't quite know how she's going to cope with this church. But she gave her heart to Christ. And then she was really very much aware that her entire family were Muslim. Her grandfather was an imam in Trinidad, and she felt very much that they would have been horrified about her commitment to Christ. But she said, I know I need to honour God, and somehow God will deal with this. I must put Jesus first, and then the rest of my family I will just commend into God's hands. About a year later, she was planning to go to Canada, and she was really worried about it because she had a number of family members in Canada who she understood were still Muslim, and she was going to visit them in Toronto. And we prayed hard for her, and we said, look, you've got to just now, when you go there, speak to them of your faith. And when she arrived, her brother had already given his heart to Christ and was going to a Pentecostal church in Toronto. See, the thing is, we don't know what God may do, but we have to choose who's first. Jesus said, I have to be greater than my allegiance, your allegiance to family members. He lived it out himself. Remember, Jesus, his family didn't believe in him. His mother, for a period of time, and the brothers and sisters were saying, he's crazy. He should be in a sanatorium. They came to stop his ministry. We reckon James, his half-brother, was probably only converted after the resurrection, when Jesus appeared to him in resurrection glory. It's very interesting that James, who writes the epistle. So the rest of Jesus' family blocked him. So he knew what it was like to have a family who weren't really with him in his ministry, but he still put the Father first. What he says afterwards in verse 27, and anyone who does not carry his cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. It's a comment that he makes at a number of points, recognizing that the shadow of the cross, recognizing that the cross is even in the window above us here, the shadow of the cross stood over him as it stands over us. And he knew that for him to be a committed disciple, it was going to cost everything. That's what we remember next week on Good Friday. And so there is a huge cost. It's not easy to be a Christian. There are many people around the world, we must remember this, many people around the world who are paying a lot for their commitment to Christ. In our church in Streatham, we were praying just 2 or 3 weeks ago for the Christians who had their houses burnt in Lahore in Pakistan. We have a South Korean lady who regularly reminds us to pray for the church in North Korea. There are many places in the world where people face martyrdom, the ultimate cost for being Christians. Jesus says, even your own life, not just your family, I must be greater. Then something about the pattern of discipleship, and he gives two kind of parabolic sayings in the verses that follow. He says, first of all, calculate the cost of accepting. Verses 28 to 30, he talks about how if you determine to build a tower, but then you run out of money, people will say that you are foolish and ridicule you because you didn't do your maths, you didn't do the calculation correctly. He's kind of saying, first of all, with discipleship, you need to calculate the cost of being committed. It's a natural follow-on from what he's saying before. He's probably speaking to a group of people who worked in an agricultural community. Maybe some of them were farmers, and some of them perhaps were building small towers as part of their farm buildings. And he's saying, it's ridiculous to start trying to build a small tower as part of your farm product if you actually then are not able to complete the project. All around us, we find people have great ideas of doing things, and then they run out of money. If you go to Liverpool, you will see there's a Roman Catholic cathedral, the one which looks like a crown of thorns. It actually sits on top of the foundation of the cathedral as it was in about 1910, but they ran out of money. And And so they didn't build another one because they didn't have any money for another 70 years. And then we have a completely different one on top. Even more bizarrely, you know that actually, as we are here in Harrow, we should be under the shadow of a copy of the Eiffel Tower. Because if you know your history of this area, you'll know that in Wembley Park, in the 1920s, as part of the exhibition that was conducted in Wembley, there was an intent to build Britain's own Eiffel Tower. Of course, in France, it's built in a beautiful site in the centre of Paris, and for some weird reason, it was going to be stuck out in a field in Wembley, which wasn't a draw card for a start. And then they only built the bottom half of it, and then they ran out of money. So actually, it was something which looked like almost like a hat. So they got to the bottom part of the tower itself, the lower stadium part, and then ran out of money when it was built the rest. And it sat there for about 10 years, slowly rusting, and then was taken down. Because they hadn't done their arithmetic. So the people who were planning to build the Eiffel Tower in Wembley looked like idiots. Because they built a bit of it, ran out of money, and then it was never completed and taken down. So it's implying that if you choose to become a Christian and you realise that that means you must be ultimately committed to Jesus, even over your family, even to the point of martyrdom, and you don't go the journey, well, you clearly didn't do your maths right. The sad thing is, for those of us who are pastors, we baptise people who within a year or 6 months are no longer walking with God, even choose another world faith, or even perhaps choose not to believe at all. Clearly these people didn't get their maths right. They didn't do the calculation. They weren't reading these stories, these statements of Jesus, realising this is a life commitment of giving of your life. Secondly, he says, calculate the cost of resisting. See, some people might say, okay, I mean, I'm really hoping no one says this at this point, you know, the 9, isn't it, getting baptised? Actually, I listened to Pastor.Phil, I'm right with this. I'm just doing my maths now in my head. No, it's not such a good idea after all. You know, I'll just hang around on the edges of church, keeping one toe in the world, one toe in the church. And, yeah, I've done the maths, and I can't quite come to that level. Well, that might be where some of us are feeling, oh, it's too big a commitment. What, to be more committed to Jesus than my family, more committed to Jesus than even my own life, committed in a way which involves the giving of the whole of myself. That's a big ask. Well, in case we're thinking like that, Jesus has another parabolic statement. He says, consider a king who is faced with going to war against another king. But this king has got 10,000 troops, but the king who's coming against him has got 20,000 troops. So, what's he going to do? Well, if he's smart, he will realise he cannot possibly win this battle, so he will send a delegation ahead of the troops and negotiate a peace settlement that's favourable to make sure that he is okay with the invading army that's heading his way. In 1939, Czechoslovakia was in this situation. Czechoslovakia had lost, if you know your history, the Sudetenlands. Hitler, being a smart aleck, had realised that not only the borderlands of Czechoslovakia, which he described as a revolver pointing at the heart of Germany, so he knew exactly what he was after, contained German-speaking peoples who he could integrate into Germany. It also included all the fortifications that the Czech Republic had against Germany because it was on the border. So he negotiated, and remember there was this peace agreement which lasted all of 12 months. There was a great deal brokered by Britain at the time. Peace in our time, said the Prime Minister of England at the time, Neville Chamberlain, and it lasted 12 months, never mind. So he negotiated away the Sudetenlands, and therefore, then Czechoslovakia is sacked almost, if you like, naked. And so Germany then says, right, we're going to invade. And they realised also that a few miles away from this now defenceless border was the beautiful city of Prague, which Hitler in a heartbeat would have pulverised. So what they did was they brokered a deal. They made a peace deal, and Germany invaded, and Prague was spared. For the Poles, Warsaw was flattered, completely flattered. The point of this, you see, is that if you know your enemy's bigger than you, then you're smart if you broker a deal. I don't know all of you in here. I know that God knows every one of you. I know that God has made every one of you. I know that Jesus died for your forgiveness. I know that Jesus rose again to give you new life. And I know that your next conscious moment after you die will not be being reunited with a grandmother or a stray cat that you used to own, but it will be coming front to front with Jesus, who is the judge of the world. So the smart thing is, guys, is actually to get to know him now, where he's offering you a peace deal, as opposed to meeting him when you die, when you are his enemy. And then you face his disapproval and a lost eternity. See, Jesus is very simply saying, if God is bigger than you, you need to think of the cost of following him, but you also need to think of the cost of resisting him. Because he's not going anywhere. Whether you believe in him or not, you will still meet him. And let us hope and pray that you meet him because you've already received the peace treaty. The last observation is also about discipleship, even though it sounds like something to do with cooking. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor the manure pile, it is thrown out. This is talking about the perseverance of discipleship. Salt was a very important commodity in the ancient world. As a preservative, it was necessary to keep meat fresh. As a flavouring, it was very valuable. It was one of the most expensive commodities that the ancient world had. It was incredibly valuable. Jesus talks about how in the Sermon on the Mount we should be like light and like salt. We should be a preservative agent. We should be a flavouring agent within the world. Here he says, if our salt, which is like discipleship, our, if you like, our intrinsic experience of God and knowledge of God, if that salt within us, if it loses its saltiness, then it's useless. Now, some of you will know that salt is salt is salt. So actually, in some sense, and that was the same in the old world, in the ancient world, how can actually salt become less salty? Or how can salt be not salt? Now, what he's talking about is something that occurred in the ancient world. Have a think about it. In ancient Israel, where did the salt come from? It came from the Dead Sea. Even now, when you go to the Dead Sea, you will see great globules of salt rising out from the water or all along the scummy edge of the Dead Sea. But the point is, this is not pure salt. Some of it is mixed with gypsum, which looks like salt. It even tastes a little bit like salt, but it is not salt. And Jesus is making a very important point. He's saying, actually, your salt needs to be real. Because if it's not salt, it looks like salt, but it isn't. Actually, it's of no worth whatsoever. In fact, there's even a little wordplay, because the Hebrew word behind saltiness is also made foolish. So in other words, actually, you can be real salt or foolish salt. Salt which pretends to be something that it's not, which is foolish. So in other words, discipleship needs to be real, and it mustn't become something else. I'm nearly at the end. One of the sad things is that many churches, in fact possibly, maybe it's a hard thing to say, most churches have people who are no longer salt. Now, they look like salt. They turn up on Sunday morning, and they're usually well dressed. They know the words of the hymns. They know the words of the songs. They can find their way through the Bible. They can look vaguely interested during the sermon. They can greet people moderately politely and leave in a hurry. And they look like they're okay. But actually, they're not salt anymore. They just look like salt. John Calvin, the Protestant reformer, he said there are two churches. There's the visible church and the invisible church. The visible church is the church that turns up on Sunday morning. The invisible church is the church that God knows. They're the real salt. And sadly, some people actually are there, but not there. One of the challenges, and I've said this quite boldly in some contexts, when there is a cultural level of faith, and I know this family network well, and some of you have journeyed from a cultural Christianity to a convictional Christianity. I don't mean that disrespectfully. It's very much the case, for example, in southern Nigeria. There's a whole raft of Yorubas who would call themselves Christian, because it's their tribal, the section of their tribe sees themselves as Christian, not Muslim. But it doesn't mean that they're born again. They really know what it means to be saved. And that's a journey from being foolish salt, actually. Salt looks like salt, to being real salt. So we need to journey into that. Some of us may be just stuck in not really being salt and need to become salt. The danger is, I would even suggest that it is possible to begin to journey in the opposite direction, to be salt and then move back towards becoming simply, almost that horrible phrase, pew fodder. People who are just around, but they're no longer living as disciples. And the expectation is that we become disciples, we face the cost of giving everything to him, we face the cost of resisting a God who is everywhere, and we stick with it. With this I close. The older I get, the more convinced I am that it's how you finish is more important than how you start. Some of the last words in the epistles by Paul are, I have kept the faith. I've run the race. I mean, surely we need to get to our last days and we think, I just kept going. I never stopped loving the Lord. I never stopped praying for people who didn't know him. I never stopped trying to do my part in the church, even if perhaps it was limited by age and health. I'm going to keep going until I die or Jesus returns. This is what Jesus is saying. This is a life commitment. And I'd urge the friends who are getting baptised, and some I know well and some I don't, but please, let this be an expression of these principles. Saying, I'm totally up for this, and I love my family, but I love Jesus more. I'm totally up for this because I don't want to fight against a God who isn't going to go away. So I want to make peace with him, and I want to show that through my baptism, I am one with him. And I want to be real salt. I want to stick with this. I don't want to move back to the foolishness stuff. I don't want to go back to being churched. I want to be a Christian, a true disciple. I want to be passionate and real about my faith and stay with that while the Lord has given me grace. That's what this is about. The vows that sometimes we take. In our church, I ask of the candidates and say, do you promise to serve the Lord in the world and in the church until your life's end? This is a lifelong vow. It's designed to be while you have breath. May be true for those who are being baptised, but may also be true for everyone to see him. In Jesus' name. Amen.